Hello? Is that better? Up? Hello? Better? Okay. So today I'm going to concern myself a lot with predictions, meaning, what comes after what we talked about yesterday. And to recap about where our lecture left off, we said that the background to the coming general election is really around two broad areas, meaning what would it mean for the ANC, meaning what should we look for, and secondly, what does it mean for the opposition, right? And for the ANC, we said that they are coming out of the local elections in bad shape, right? And this we saw in terms of the trends. And we also see this in terms of just the general climate or conditions of governance, right? And that the more people protest and the more people fall into poverty means that things are not going okay, right? And for the first time, what we saw is that this has had electoral consequences, right? Before, this was never the case for the ANC. I think that trends, beyond the last 5 years have been that when people aren't happy with the ANC, their argument always is, well, it was a bad year, and you vote again. Whereas now we're seeing new electoral behavioral trends. The second thing is that there is a fallout at the moment in terms of who is to blame for losing Johannesburg, who is to blame for losing Tshwane, and who is to blame for losing Port Elizabeth. Right, and this is feeding into the succession debate around whether or not one must continue with things as is, or what to replace Zuma with, or whether or not the problem is beyond Mr. Zuma. And so therefore the place to watch is the national conference. This is where the ANC is today. For the part of the opposition, I think that the local elections for them was a turning point, right? For the first time, Johannesburg has switched hands in terms of governance. And for the first time, Tshwane has shifted hands, and Port Elizabeth. This is significant, and what they do with this will depend on how voters respond. And once again, this can either go one of two ways, right? Either it can go the Cape Town way, in which the DA was able to accelerate its share of the vote over a 10-year period, to the point whereby the ANC here is irrelevant, right? That's one option. Or it can go the Durban road, in which you hold power briefly, but then it switches hands again in the following election, right? Meaning a lot of this has to do with what's going to happen with an EFF-DA partnership, and whether or not their voters will give them a mandate to continue that partnership. So we'll have to watch what's going to happen in the DA in its next Federal Congress, meaning will DA members affirm the Maimane group, or will they say, actually, no, EFF is a bad partner? And at the same time, we have to watch what the EFF Congress will do, meaning will their members say, well, then DA is what we should go for, or else let's think about something else. Which means, therefore, that there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fluidity. Things aren't clear as yet. And so what we can take out from this is that what is clear is that whatever happens inside the ANC is going to have relevance for how the DA and the EFF respond. Which means, therefore, that where I'm going to move from is exactly that, right? In that developments in the ANC are going to define what happens the way forward. And there are two things to look out for. The first one is its national conference. And here we have to identify certain trends happening inside the ANC over time to have an idea about how the balance of forces are beginning to shape up. And things are changing in the ANC rapidly, right? The second thing to look at are who the dominant and competing groups are. And I'm going to identify two main groups in the party. The The first is what I'll call traditionalists, and the second, our reformers. And to a large extent, while we recognize that ANC politics are complex, I think that over the Zuma years, two ideological strands have emerged. And what happens with the fate of each of them, I think, is going to define, firstly, what happens in the ANC, secondly, how the DA will respond to it, and secondly, how the EFF will respond, which means that I leave open this possibility that the EFF, under certain circumstances, might go back to the ANC, which could further realign politics, obviously depending on how the fight moves along inside the ANC. And the same thing as who succeeds Mr. Zuma might have consequences for who the DA might think is an appropriate leader, right? Which could once again affect the partnership in Johannesburg, in Tshwane, in Port Elizabeth, and who knows what the possibilities. Now, insofar as the ANC's national conference, basically it is an elective conference, and things are not as simple as they seem, which means that the issue is not about who the party president is. Yes, he's an important person, but there are other positions that are equally important and that could constrain whoever succeeds Mr. Zuma. Right? And here we're looking at three areas of elections. The first is the election of the national executive. In the ANC, you cannot get anything done unless you have the support or the majority of people who sit in this body. Simple as that. Meaning, you can't think about reforming the party, rethinking branches, amending the constitution, changing the electoral system without controlling who sits in the NEC. Secondly, the majority, if not all parliamentarians, are NEC members. And we are a Westminster system, which means if you control the NEC, you control the party caucus. You control that, you control the majority party in parliament, you can do a lot of power. However, if there's a disjunction between who's in the NEC and who's the party president, then you have a different kind of stalemate. Right? Secondly, is that there are 6 office bearers, and sometimes who is the party president may be at odds with who the deputy president is. Meaning they may come from different groupings inside the party, which means that in terms of the scenarios that I'm going to introduce to you, they will look at the different variations that this can take, from complete victories by either group to how a consensus would look like and its consequences. The second thing to note is that the people who vote at ANC conferences are branch delegates, very similar to an electoral college, which means, therefore, that is firstly, who gets to be a delegate, who chooses, and how many do you need to get elected. Right, so it's quite a complicated internal process, but one that is rife with manipulation. Which means, therefore, that in the end, it's not even the majority of ANC voters who vote for the NEC. Right, and that has led to problems. Now, in terms of how the numbers look like in the ANC generally has fluctuated figures, right? And these are figures that I've worked with over the years. But generally speaking, the NGC is what is called the National General Council, which is your highest decision-making body between conferences, right? The figures are all the different provincial numbers inside the ANC over these years. And as you can see, these figures fluctuate considerably. And the trend we have is that on the eve of every national conference, figures escalate. They double. Right? Between a national conference and an NGC, they dip. And so therefore, the ANC never really has a general membership figure between elections. And there's a considerable amount of manipulation in terms of numbers, depending on which province is organized and which is not. So a province like the Western Cape, for instance, which was completely decimated by the DA, has just experienced very, very low figures generally. Whereas a province like the Eastern Cape, that for many years has had a monopoly, will tend to have high figures, generally speaking. Right. The second thing to note are these figures in brackets. And these basically constitute the branch delegates from those provinces who were given a mandate to vote in elections. And as you can see, there are 3 big provinces inside the ANC. The first is KZN, which ever since Mr. Zuma came into power, right, because you must remember how Zuma becomes popular in the ANC is through basically destroying the IFP, right, and all IFP branches, politicians folded into him. And so the numbers for the ANC were inflated considerably through KZN, to the point where by now, nothing ever gets done without the support of KZN, right? Which obviously has shifted the way the ANC has operated historically, where the Eastern Cape had the kind of place that KZN has now. The second thing to note is that the decline of members from 2012 to 2015, in some cases more than halved. Right? This is where their electoral crisis comes into play. Right? But despite that, it hasn't had a negative impact on the major provinces where you are going to have branch delegates coming from. KZN, Eastern Cape, Gauteng. Which means that who controls each of those will to some extent depend on how branch delegates could vote. Now, in terms of who are the competing factions, right, I identify 2. The first is what I call the traditionalists, right? And this group basically is the one that Mr. Zuma would like to succeed in. And their argument is continuity, right? Pretty much like ruling from the grave, if you like, which means that they tend to be quite consistent with his politics. That is, firstly, they tend to have a majority rural power base. Right? So if we're looking at KZN, we're looking at Northern Natal, we're looking at Mpumalanga, we're looking at Northwest. Secondly, they tend to be socially conservative, right? Whereby they use traditional leaders as an instrument of control in rural areas, which means that they would support those related types of laws, traditional courts bill and all these things, in order to show up the power of chiefs in rural areas. Thirdly, there's an ethnic element into this group, meaning it tends to be dominated mainly by Zulu people, but the conservative part of it, right? And fourthly, there tends to be a commitment to a strong centralized state and a general mistrust of urban politics and liberal politics, right? So things around gay and lesbians, or things around, I don't know, constitutionalism are sort of frowned upon, right? People argue that all these laws are un-African, that there's an African way of doing things, and so they tend to conform to those kinds of politics, which makes them different kind of nationalists, right? And one that sort of play on your kind of redistributive policies without thinking about growth, right? And their candidate, as per now, is Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, right? She is the kind of front person for this group. The second group is an alliance of mainly anti-Zuma people, but I think that those that have sort of coalesced around a kind of central way of thinking, and we'll call them the reformists, right? And these tend to be mainly an urban-based group, especially around Johannesburg. They tend to be social democrats. Your traditionalists tend to be older, for example. Reformists tend to range in age. So you have your born frees on the one hand, right up to your Ramaphosas in one group. They tend to be multi-ethnic. And they also tend to be closer to the trade unions, especially COSATU. And they are organized around the Gauteng-based ANC, right? So it's a very, very Johannesburg and urban-centered group. They tend to think of themselves as strong and constitutionalists, right? Now, in terms of what can happen, right? And this is where I get into my predictions, is that there are three possible outcomes from this year's national conference, right? And the first is a traditionalist victory, which I think would bring about a certain set of outcomes that will be the same in certain respects but different to a reformist victory. Right, so the first two scenarios is either one of these two groups wins, and things happen if they win. And the third option is if there's a compromise, meaning if things get too hot, too heated, and they decide, actually, let's smoke the peace pipe and move on. And what I'll do is I'll paint out my three different scenarios, and hopefully we can have a constructive discussion around these. The first scenario, Mr. Zuma gets his way, right? Which means that his whole grouping triumphs, right? And by this, we're looking at all your usual suspects. We're looking at the continuation of the Guptas, the list goes on, right? And by that we mean they dominate the NEC, and they're able to dominate Parliament, or not dominate as yet, sorry, right? And what I predict is that what this group will do, because this group's main bugbear is the EFF, right? And we've seen this in the debates around the Nkandla issue, around the state capture issue, and that they have this EFF headache, right? And what I suspect they will do is that they will try to outflank the EFF by, climbing on their populist bandwagon, right? Which means that they will tend to prioritize, from a policy point of view, ideas around redistribution without growth. Now, I think that if this lot comes into power, you will have four things that could be important. And the first one is the ANC will split, right? Why I say this is because that's what the trend has shown in the last 6 years. In the sense that whenever you have this kind of triumph, somebody leaves. Cope first left, the EFF also left, and I think that a trend will form if this happens. right? It's a winner takes all in this context. Secondly, is that following the trends that we saw yesterday, this will be accompanied by an electoral decline in urban areas. Right, which means that if the Gauteng ANC loses the internal party fight, they lose everything. Right? And thirdly, is that I think that we'll therefore see the same pattern as we've seen in the metro elections at a local level, in which we see a significant decline in vote share for the ANC, right, brought about by the usual suspects, that is lower voter turnout, firstly, amongst ANC voters, and or perhaps a shift in voter choice. And thirdly, a resurgent opposition. The best gift to the DA and the EFF is the Zuma group. And the best gift for the DA and the EFF is the Zuma group. That's what has given the DA a lifeline, right? It dominates every newspaper, every story, conversation that was, and it has, in many ways, defined opposition politics for the last 5 years, right? And this trend, I think, continues. Yes. No, that's fine. Yes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, if I look at their list, I mean, I think that, okay, let me start. I think that if we take the sort of traditionalist view, right, I think that the debate, I think, within that group is between whether or not they should have a woman president, meaning they should go for that principle, or that should not be the determining factor. But they're still in the same group though, right? And I think that if I look at whom they put forward, it was Ace Magashule, who's the Free State Premier. I don't think that that would be a strong enough candidate in such a polarized internal party fight. And so for me, I would project how that group would reach their consensus to match Ramaphosa would be Dlamini Zuma. In fact, I can't see anybody out of that group apart from her being fielded as a reliable candidate to fight against Ramaphosa. That's my thing, right? However, even if hypothetically, for instance, say Dlamini Zuma is not their candidate, meaning they found it out, she says, I'm done, you guys, you're on your own, I still think that the outcome will be the same. Yes?
I read this morning on the internet that Brenda has already said Zuma is going to be the candidate, not Ramaphosa.
Whoa. Either way, it's the same group. Maybe a worse outcome, right? Because the worst outcome would... Okay, sorry. Well, we'll see. But for me, either way, it is the same group and the outcome remains, right? But I think that for me, where I'm going to throw my hat on is that I feel that under this option, they lose their majority in Parliament. Right? And I think that for me, why I...
Can we continue with your lecture?
Okay, sorry, yes. Okay, sure, right. I think that they will lose their majority in Parliament, right? And I think that this is based on the local trends in urban areas and what it would mean from a proportional point of view, and that you'll have a new reformist coalition after 2019, right? Which means that your reformist group will leave. Right, and how they will leave, I think, will depend on the way in which they lose that majority, right? And so, for instance, you could have a case where it could look like Johannesburg, right, in which they get 46% or 48%. And then from that point of view, they could either leave, meaning they do an EFF and cope, and align with another reformist coalition, which could include a DA or an EFF. The second outcome is if the other side wins, right? Meaning if you have a Ramaphosa and a reformist group that wins. And I think that the strength of this new group is that what they're marketing, that is, what they're putting forward, is a renewal of the tripartite alliance. Right? And the benefit of that alliance is that it brings numbers and the strength of mobilization to the ANC. And always, a strong alliance has electoral benefits for the ANC. And that's the argument they put forward. What would need to happen for this, however, would be a rapid transition in new leadership, which means we are more likely to see Mr. Zuma leaving power after he steps down as the ANC president. We are more likely to see the cabinet being recalled and a rapid transition into something new. That transition, however, I think, would be unlike what we saw post-Polokwane, which led to uncertainty and which affected the economy. This group is very much that group that tries to find consensus between government, labor, and business, which is good for business, right? Which means, therefore, that they are likely to prioritize things like economic growth. Now, consequences is, firstly, I think the ANC will split also. Which means on both of the options, if either group wins, someone leaves. Right? And that while a traditionalist purge would be confined to the party, a reformist purge will include the whole system. The reinstatement of charges against Mr. Zuma. It'll include dealing with the Gupta issue beyond the ANC, which I think would be a much more comprehensive purge than the traditionalists, right? And this what would create a split. How that split would happen, would be in the context of, firstly, a decline of the ANC in rural areas, right? Meaning it would have electoral consequences, and one could see a resurgent IFP, right? Already we've seen this in certain parts of KZN in this local election, where they remained dormant but are on the way up, right? But at the same time, I think that a reformist victory will hurt the EFF and the DA. Because why then would you try to vote for the DA if you've got reformists in power in the ANC? Right? It'll also hurt the EFF, because what has breathed life to the EFF has been the traditionalists blundering every day. Right? However, I think that you'll also see at the same time new reformist coalitions after 2019, meaning it could impact on the DA to the extent that this group might purge people from there, right, in certain areas. And the third option is if it's business as usual, right, a compromise. And I think that people often try to make overtures in the context of a potential split. And so this scenario is based on what happens if those overtures work. Meaning if people say, okay, fine, yes, let's prevent either a reformist or a traditionalist split. If this happens, things stay the same. compromise deals may make sense for party unity, but from a governance point of view, things don't change. Right? People walk on eggshells because you want to prevent a fight at all costs. In this scenario, what will probably happen is a compromise slate of reformists and traditionalists. Right? A sort of balancing act that keeps the house in order, but we just muddle along. But we trip and fall and muddle and complain, but things don't change that much. Right? Maybe we might get Zuma to step down after somebody new is elected, but it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't change the overall context of governance. And in this case, I predict that two things can happen. Right? Either the ANC's support base goes just below an absolute majority or just above, depending on how that compromise is managed. Secondly, I think that we probably will see the same patterns at a local level, sorry, at a national level, as we saw in the local level, right? Which means a continued increase in DA and EFF support, but not to the extent that will be possible if your traditionalist seize power in the ANC. And so therefore, if we are to map this all out, I think that these are the options, right? And note that in two of the options, I predict the party breaks. And when the party breaks, new coalitions are formed, right? Consistent with what I think our party system is evolving towards. Either one of the options where one group wins power, I think will have electoral consequences. If you have your Zuma group, they lose. The figures have showed us that. If the other group, they maintain their majority, but not in any significant way. And if things remain the same, meaning if they smoke the peace pipe and decide that let's all work in the interest of party unity, then things slide, maybe not so much, but the party remains shaky as a whole, and you have a more formalized partnership between the EFF and the DA at a national level. Okay, I'll stop now and open up the floor. Okay, let's say 1, 2, 3. Yes. No, you, these three. Sorry, you, and then you with stripes and orange as the first round. No, at the back. Yeah. Yeah.
Does the general electorate still regard the DA as a white man's party, and therefore perhaps Mamane as a token? And if this is not the case, what is the possibility in your view of a possible merging of the reformist group with the DA?
Okay, I'll take maybe 3 first. Yes.
Then I've got 2 questions. First of all, KZN is obviously a very important player in this conference.
Yeah.
But I understand that there is divisions within KZN itself. Mm-hmm. And one of the key personalities there would be, where will McKeezy go? On what slate will he go? That's the one question. And if he should go on Cyril's slate, then Cyril might win this battle. And the other question is, if you have a compromise, is there the possibility that that compromise will be led by Vedi Matashi?
Okay. Yes.
I've also got 2 questions. One is, under any of those scenarios, what happens with the level of demonstrations throughout the country?
Sure.
And the second question is, how far will the reformers go? Could they change the constitution to bring in constituencies?
Okay.
To control corruption so that MPs are accountable to the people in their constituency rather than to the party.
Okay, I'll do the first question first. I think that the DA, I think, is not a homogeneous party. Oh, sorry. The question was, to what extent does the electorate think that the DA is still a white party, and whether or not they regard Mr. Maimane as a coconut? And number two, the second part was that to what extent will the reformist group in the ANC, am I correct, and the DA reformist group, come together and merge? I think on your first question, the DA is not a homogeneous party. That's the first thing, right? Which means that how the DA looks like in Cape Town and Johannesburg is very different to how it looks like in Bloemfontein, right? And the same with how it looks like in, say, a rural area, right? And when I look at the DA, I mean, I've for a few years, I've sort of looked at its trend, and I've written some stuff about it and some research. What I found is that you tend to have, firstly, a very big generational divide inside the DA, right? And one for me that in my first impression of it looked like these are two different parties in one. The second thing that I saw is that you've got a very strong rural-urban divide in how the DA looks like, which means that in rural areas, it tends to be very, very white, right? But in urban areas, it tends to be very, very mixed, right? And in rural areas, it's almost, I would say, 80% older. In urban areas, you have a much more greater spread of the DA, right? And it differs by urban area. So in Johannesburg and in Cape Town, for instance, it's a lot more of a, I would say, a diverse party, pretty much. Like it's got pretty much everybody and anything in it, right? Tshwane, it's only now changing, right? But even then, if I look at the mayor's group, Msimanga, right? And the people who were in that council in the last 2 terms, they are so different. How they interact, I don't know, but they're so different, right? By contrast, in Joburg and Cape Town, they gel. People are, they all went to UCT, they were at Wits, they were at Rondebosch Boys High, and the whole list goes on, right? And so for me, if I think about Maimane, for instance, I think that he belongs to a certain group inside the DA that has found resonance with people who are not DA. That group, not so much him, but his group, which is a diverse group of people, right? Who are in DASO and all these things, right? Which means that for where they hold power, people don't see that group in that light. Meaning they have no problems with it, right? And I think that the shift happens with the DA in Tshwane mainly, not so much, but whereby once again through that Msimanga group are able to increase their share of the vote in places like Attridgeville and places like Mamelodi, right? Which is very different from the DA in Nelspruit, where people would tend to be more averse to it there. And so for me, I don't think that there is a general view of the DA. I think that, through its period of transformations, it's just been able to get different kinds of people who all have different perceptions over it. Now, whether or not, or the extent to which the reformist group will merge with the ANC, I think is a possibility. Yes. Yes. And I think that for me is that if I look at the DA and that fights within it, right, it is this whatever group in the DA against other contenders. And the question for me would be, would we see similar trends in the DA, to the ANC, meaning when losers in fights, do they leave or not? That's the big issue for me. But I think that if you have a scenario in which there is a significant realignment in our party system that leads to a reformist break in the ANC that coincides with reformist losers in the DA, you might have new coalitions. That would be where I would put my neck on the block here. Your question was, oh gosh. On KZN, yes. Oh, yes.
Who's going to lead this compromise, the third option?
Okay. Okay, it's all about the numbers. All about the numbers. Now, everything, I think the delegates in the next conference will look more like the 2012 conference, right? An inflated number, I think, right? And as of now, the province that is running the most aggressive campaign of recruitment is KZN, right? The other provinces are more or less, muddling through, which means that they will make up the biggest portion of delegates. Everything depends on whether those delegates, which could lead to, say, maybe plus minus 1,000, right, out of normally about 4,000, whether or not they all vote on the same mandate. And I think no. And the reason why is because there's a split in the Natal ANC at the moment, right? Mainly over the post-Zuma era. Natal was as united as Zuma was a president. And as his transition towards his exit is getting nearer, a vacuum is being formed in Natal at the moment, right? And there are basically two possibilities. I think that you're quite right. Mkhize is one option. But Mkhize alone cannot unite the Natal ANC. I think the fight has taken on a life of its own. And so what you'd like to see is a divided Natal, a divided Limpopo, and possibly a divided Eastern Cape. And when we did the figures, right, about a week ago, we looked at possibilities. And every possibility was a difference of about a few hundred on each side. And so it's going to resemble the Mbeki fight, basically, which was similar, meaning every province was split, either 50-50 or 40-60 or whichever permutation, which means that Mkhize may be important, but he is not as important as people make him out to be, which means that this leads to who could be the compromise. You can only be a compromise insofar as you are nominated. If you are not nominated, you are not on the slate. And at the moment, only one person, so two people are going to get nominated. And there's nobody else yet. And neither group is fielding a third name. Which means that in terms of where we are now, if all things remain equal, we are in the first two, which is a replay of the Mbeki-Zuma fight. And that's where it is. Your question?
Yeah.
Yes, please. Yes.
So under any of those scenarios, what happens to the level of
violence?
Yes.
Okay. Under any, within any of these scenarios, what happens to the levels of demonstrations? That's a very difficult question. And why so is because demonstrations are beyond the ANC, I think. And so if we were to take each of them in turn, if we take a compromise, right, which basically means everything remains as it is, it means exactly that. Things don't change. And so, the same governance, etc. I think that if either group wins, traditionalists will weaken the party. If you weaken the party and you lose a majority, you create conditions for new coalitions. New coalitions could lead to more competition, a new party in power, even, or a new coalition in power that might be more responsive to the concerns of people. Right. If I think about Tshwane, for example, and my mother lives there, and I asked her, over dinner, so, how's life under the DA? What's going on, right? And she and my mother is not a DA supporter at all, right? She's very kind of disillusioned ANC. And I asked her, so how are things going, since this, opponent is in power? She said to me that, Zweli, for the first time, they collect garbage every Friday. Now, that's a very small thing. And my mother lives in an upmarket area, mind you, right? Now, that's a very small thing, Things that I take for granted, Every Friday my bin I put out and it's taken and I put it back in and, life goes on, right? But when things have fallen apart to that extent, and people begin to not make slogans, but just fix the pothole or the lights are on, or it affects how people perceive you, right? And so even in the case of protests, and protests normally are about exactly that, right? That you haven't, my bin is still out, it smells, it's, I don't like living like this, or, this pipe isn't fixed, water just gushes out, and people often protest over small things that become big things because you don't respond to it. It's not that they're saying, let's remake the world, right? And so therefore, I think that sometimes, and this is an important thing when I think about democracy and the alternation of power, right, is that sometimes when new people come in, they have different ways of responding to problems, which would negate the need to protest, right? And so, but at the same time, if your reformists come into power, right, and reformists are establishment people. So Cyril is a businessman, and he's been in the ANC for many, many years. And so has Pravin Gordhan, and so have all these people that we think are reformists, right, and who we think are good. But they haven't governed in a way that has been in any way, positive for ordinary people. They might be liked by Washington and London and Paris, but back home, you're not really doing the great job at all. And so, even though a reformist victory may seem good in principle, you might not get the kind of outcome that would lead to a change in how people experience basic things, potholes and power cuts and all these things. Which means, therefore, that a pure observation of how people respond to changes in governance is that new people always have new ways of doing things, and whereas the potential for violent protest is closed. Now, I remember your next question was whether or not there would be a shift in the electoral system. I think that for that to happen, you require a 2/3 majority in Parliament. And as of now, which would mean that you would need to have the consent of all the other parties. Now, as of now, I don't believe that any party has an interest in moving from a PR system to a first past the post, because they would lose. PR systems favor small parties. And a first past the post system, depending on how you draw the boundaries, may lead to an ANC coming back with more vengeance, because it's based on constituencies, which means that if a party like the DA is concentrated in one area, there's a limit as to how many seats you can win. Whereas a party like the ANC is spread out and has power in its spread, would probably win more seats under that system. Meaning, yes, you would resolve the problem of, say, voter MP relations, right? Because you just phone your MP if there's a pothole, or you phone your MP if you've got whatever problem. But it could mean that it might not resolve the multi-party problem.
But isn't it a structural deformity at the heart of the Australian Constitution? That it makes people accountable to the party, not to the people.
The question was, isn't it a structural deformity? It depends. I think it depends. For me, it's not that simple, because yes, we don't vote directly for our MPs. That's true, right? That's very true. However, according to how we exercise the closed list system, is that MPs are allocated constituencies. I know it sounds odd, but that's how the system resolves the issue. But you're right, though. You're quite correct in the sense that in terms of accountability, the MP is accountable to who puts them there, and the party puts them there. That's true. But whether or not it'll change, I don't think so. Do I think it should change? Yes. But I don't think that it should be a wholesale change, in the sense that you replace one or the other. I think that there are ways in which one can mix systems in a way that benefits the inclusive part of a PR with the accountability part of a first past the post. That can happen, yes. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, and yes. Yeah?
To what extent can eggs on the farm change the numbers? For example, we're finding at the moment, Cape Town, a huge increase from East Cape to Cape Town. Same thing in Johannesburg, they've been drawing from all over the country. So your population changes. And at the moment, the DA controls the economic arm. Between Joburg, Tswana, PE, Cape Town, they must control 70% of the economic arm. Now, to what extent can that actually change all the numbers you're talking about? So that it actually force a change in the political structure.
Okay. Yes.
There are obviously many variables you haven't spoken about. Tribal, for example, where the centre of the ANC has moved from the Eastern Cape to the Khoza to the Zulu and the Natal. And I suspect there might be a resentment factor. What is the limits? Has the EDF essentially topped off? Is its base angry youth, angry unemployed people, angry students?
Yes.
And you've assumed that Zuma gives up the presidency of the ANC. There's no term limit on that. There's a term limit on being president. So he rules from the rear and almost does a Putin in a variation. He and Putin are very similar in many ways. And he rules from the rear. It is also designed to protect him from the prosecution in court, amongst many other things, and of course continues to give him access to the thievery. And just let me say that I've always thought that the ANC, if it were clever, would improve the South African economy because there would be so much more to steal.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. Okay, I'll start with the first one. The first one was to what extent can the numbers change things? Or, sorry, economic power change the numbers? I think it has already. And I think that if you look at the transformation of the DA, right, in the sense that before it controlled Cape Town, meaning before, say when it was, DP first, right? And then it became NNP, DP, it merged. It was a whole mess. People did a whole lot of funny things. And then it went through a period of decline. And it comes back up in 2006, if I may be correct, right? Where it leads a coalition government in Cape Town. And if you look at the DA then, it was, they didn't have much money, firstly, right? If they did have money, it was through, whoever was whose friend. It had no strong party structures. It sort of depended on a very aging kind of Democratic Party, an aging national party infrastructure, right, of recruitment and training and all these things. I think the moment it controls Cape Town for a term, it's a big turnaround, massive turnaround, because not only do you use big in power as a way of showing people what you can do, but you use big in power as a way of recruiting people and being present, right? And you align yourself with various people and various business people who help, and before you know it, you grow from being this small thing to a largish organization, right? Which gives you enough money to recruit and mobilize for a province, which in turn gives you enough money to invest in your party, paying people, and all these things. Right, and so controlling a large metro, which involves employing lots of people in different capacities, and also controlling budgets that exceed some provinces, has huge benefits. Also to the basic skills of your party leaders, how to oppose a governing party, for instance. You learn that from being in government. And so yes, numbers make a big difference, yes. Which is why, the way I see these scenarios, I look at where the money is. I look at Joburg, Pretoria, and say, well, who's going to run these big organizations? And if it shifts hands, that's important. Because it's important in two ways. It's important in terms of your visibility, right? So if you are EFF, you only exist in Parliament, and so what people think about you depends on what SABC shows you at night, right? By contrast, if you run a city, like I said, you're doing all these things. You are collecting garbage. You are making sure that the lights are on. You do all these things that people see in a different way. And that, I think, provides opportunity for any party, if you like, to form some kind of contract with citizens. And the more organized you are, people will respond to that, I think. So for sure, definitely, yes.
I was actually thinking changing some of the numbers per province.
Mm-hmm.
The relevance of KZN That would have changed the power base.
I think where the ANC's numbers are a bit flipped there is because it has lost, say, beyond the last 5 years, have been that when people aren't happy with the ANC, their argument always is, well, it was a bad year, and you vote again. Whereas now we're seeing new electoral behavioral trends. The second thing is that there is a fallout at the moment in terms of who is to blame for losing Johannesburg, who is to blame for losing Tshwane, and who is to blame for losing Port Elizabeth. Right, and this is feeding into the succession debate around whether or not one must continue with things as is, or what to replace Zuma with, or whether or not the problem is beyond Mr. Zuma. And so therefore the place to watch is the national conference. This is where the ANC is today. For the part of the opposition, I think that the local elections for them was a turning point, right? For the first time, Johannesburg has switched hands in terms of governance. And for the first time, Tshwane has shifted hands, and Port Elizabeth. This is significant, and what they do with this will depend on how voters respond. And once again, this can either go one of two ways, right? Either it can go the Cape Town way, in which the DA was able to accelerate its share of the vote over a 10-year period, to the point whereby the ANC here is irrelevant, right? That's one option. Or it can go the Durban road, in which you hold power briefly, but then it switches hands again in the following election, right? Meaning a lot of this has to do with what's going to happen with an EFF-DA partnership, and whether or not their voters will give them a mandate to continue that partnership. So we have to watch what's going to happen in the DA in its next Federal Congress, meaning will DA members affirm the Maimane group, or will they say, actually, no, EFF is a bad partner? And at the same time, we have to watch what the EFF Congress will do, meaning will their members say, well, then DA is what we should go for, or else let's think about something else. Which means, therefore, that there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fluidity. Things aren't clear as yet. And so, hello? Is that better? Up? Hello? Better? Okay. So today, I'm going to concern myself a lot with predictions, meaning, you know, what comes after what we talked about yesterday. And to recap about where our lecture left off, we said that the background to the coming general election is really around two broad areas, meaning what would it mean for the ANC, meaning what should we look for, and secondly, what does it mean for the opposition, right? And for the ANC, we said that they are coming out of the local elections in bad shape, right? And this we saw in terms of the trends. And we also see this in terms of just the general climate or conditions of governance, right? And that the more people protest and the more people fall into poverty means that things are not going okay, right? And for the first time, what we saw is that this has had electoral consequences, right? Before, this was never the case for the ANC. I think that trends, or what we can take out from this, is that what is clear is that whatever happens inside the ANC is going to have relevance for how the DA and the EFF respond. Which means, therefore, that where I'm going to move from is exactly that, right? In that developments in the ANC are going to define what happens the way forward. And there are two things to look out for. The first one is its national conference. And here we have to identify certain trends happening inside the ANC over time to have an idea about how the balance of forces are beginning to shape up. And things are changing in the ANC rapidly, right? The second thing to look at are who the dominant and competing groups are. And I'm going to identify two main groups in the party. The first is what I'll call traditionalists, and the second, our reformers. And to a large extent, while we recognize that ANC politics are complex, I think that over the Zuma years, two ideological strands have emerged. And what happens with the fate of each of them, I think, is going to define, firstly, what happens in the ANC, secondly, how the DA will respond to it, and secondly, how the EFF will respond, which means that I leave open this possibility that the EFF, under certain circumstances, might go back to the ANC, which could further realign politics, obviously depending on how the fight moves along inside the ANC. And the same thing as who succeeds Mr. Zuma might have consequences for who the DA might think is an appropriate leader, right? Which could once again affect the partnership in Johannesburg, in Tshwane, in Port Elizabeth, and who knows what the possibilities. Now, insofar as the ANC's national conference, basically it is an elective conference, and things are not as simple as they seem, which means that the issue is not about who the party president is. Yes, he's an important person,